everybody for coming. So not only is this an emerging scholars lecture, but this emerging scholar is going to give you really emerging work. It's some new stuff, and that's partly why I wanted to present it to this audience, which I thought would be kind of diverse and help me think through some of these ideas. I'm also kind of giving you some stuff to chew on. I'll say a little bit about the book I'm working on now and how this comes out of that project. So the project I'm working on now is on the early skyscraper and thinking about how that skyscraper, the early skyscraper in particular, which was so radical in the way it changed the way that cities looked and the way people moved through cities, also really changed the way that people were reading race and the way that people were imagining race to work and how race was perceived and read and interpreted in all kinds of ways. So this way of thinking about architecture's role in shaping the conditions of racial interpretation or racial hermeneutics. So that's not what I'm giving today, but I can always talk about skyscrapers, so if you have any questions, I can talk about skyscrapers. But this new work really moves forward to the mid-century to think about some of these issues in light of suburbanization and to really think about the Great Migration and white flight as these kind of not just processes that are related, but literary genealogies that end up being related in all kinds of interesting ways. So the talk is really going to break down into two parts. One that's a little bit more historical, where I'm trying out some new research, and the second part will kind of think about what literature might have to do with all of this. Can everyone hear me? It's not too echoey? Okay, great. The Federal Housing Authority, which is known as the FHA, so I'll call it the FHA for most of this talk. The Federal Housing Authority generally sits at the center of any study of real estate and racial inequality during the 20th century. This government agency was created as part of the National Housing Act of 1934 in response to the massive foreclosures and the drastic decrease in homeownership after the Great Depression. The FHA's job was to regulate the rates of interest and mortgage terms, increasing the number of people who could afford the down payment and mortgages along the way, creating a new market for single-family homes that would grow with kind of boom at the end of World War II, the GI Bill, which would kind of further facilitate the ability to buy single-family homes and paving the way for the mass urbanization of the country that we kind of associate with the mid-century. And it really changed the way that people bought homes. Before the FHA, you had to have a pretty sizable down payment to buy a home. Mortgage terms were about 5 years, so you had to kind of take out mortgage after mortgage after mortgage. It was a very more complicated process. So the FHA is kind of celebrated and also not celebrated for making this easier for certain people. But to tell the story of the FHA is also to tell the story of redlining and housing discrimination practices, which have gone on to have such deleterious impacts on wealth distribution along racial lines, effects that still linger today. And I imagine that will be much of what will be discussed at the Neighborhood Forum next week. I just want to back up and define that term redlining. I think everyone pretty much knows what it means, but just so we're on the same page, it's a term that most commonly used to refer to the practices used to deny African Americans access to certain housing markets since their presence was deemed to devaluate property. And this is not the term that the FHA was using themselves. This is a term that gets coined in the 60s, I think, to really kind of demarcate that process of kind of circling neighborhoods and red lines, right, and saying these are where we'll finance mortgages, and this is where we won't, based on class, but really predominantly based around questions of race. So the most central document that's typically used to think about the FHA's role in this process of redlining and the way that social influences such as race became part of the appraisal process is the FHA Underwriting Manual, published in 1936. So that's only about 2 years after the FHA is founded. So this manual was written under the guidance of a real estate appraiser known as Frederick Babcock. And he's kind of interesting. He is the son of William Babcock, who was one of these kind of great real estate moguls working in the Loop. And so this is at the moment where real estate, the profession of real estate isn't really professionalized. It's kind of localized, it's disparate, and there's this big push to professionalize the profession of being a real estate agent and to professionalize the practices of appraising real estate. So Babcock, Frederick Babcock is kind of pushed by his father to write this manual that attempts to norm these processes. So he writes this kind of the manual to the FHA's manual in 1924 called the Appraisal of Real Estate. And this early book is generally credited as the first to kind of suggest that appraisers should attend to social influences when appraising property. So, you know, the things that happen when you appraise property are still many of the things that still happen today, right? You look at the condition, is the foundation cracked, right? Where's the location of it? How close is it to certain amenities? And certainly the language of race and class had been in the air around appraising real estate, but this is the first time we kind of see it in print in Babcock's first manual. So Babcock would be invited by the FHA to help them write their official kind of federal manual about this. And so here's the language that Babcock uses in the 1936 manual. He says, quote, "Valuators appraising homes for federally backed mortgages should investigate areas surrounding the location to determine whether or not incompatible racial and social groups are present, to the end that an intelligent prediction may be made regarding the possibility or probability of the location being invaded by such groups. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupation generally leads to instability and reductions in values," end quote. So this is a kind of, and then many manuals would kind of adopt this language and twist it and turn it in different ways. But I'm interested in the language that he's using to talk about what one actually does in this process of appraisal. He's talking about going out and investigating, exploring, using language of possibility and probability and prediction. This language about kind of being an empirical investor, right? Go out into the neighborhood, use your eyes, and investigate. But these verbs are also quite vague. What are you investigating? How are you investigating? What are the practices of surveying? How do you read, class and race in certain ways, right? It's vague, but it's still wrapped in this language of the language of empiricism. Other manuals from the era would make similar empirical claims, urging the field that it needed to operate less like a group of small and isolated localities and adopt more standardized forms and practices in order to lend valuation universal legitimacy. It really mattered that it was legitimate, right? Because people had to believe in the process of appraisal. If they didn't believe it, it would have no value, right? It's like the stock market, right? You have to believe in it for it to work. And real estate was realizing we have to like be legit for our appraisal to have any grounding. And so we see that kind of legitimacy language that Babcock's trying to instill, and that really isn't there before this. But there remained discrepancies between various appraisal manuals about how much empiricism was too much, this kind of balance between instinct and what you think the consumer wants and what you actually can see. So whereas Babcock remains insistent that he uses terms like data and classification, that they can fully supplant personal judgment, if we look at something like Stanley L. Michaels' appraising manual, which is published in 1937, we find Babcock's language of empirical appraisal more explicitly meaning the language of racial adjudication. So this is a little quote from McMichaels in the section called Blighted Areas. Quote, "The appraiser must approach the problem with an open mind and effectively combat any preconceived notions, blind prejudice, or snap judgment he may have formed. His appraisal should be made with the head and not with the heart, and he must base his conclusions on facts and not fancies, bearing in mind at all times that he is judging the future and not the past." So again, I'm really interested in this language of the mindset of appraisal rather than the practices of appraisal, right? With no detail, but just these kind of vague ways that you should comport yourself when you're observing. The vague task of judging the future and not the past, based on, quote, the head and not with the heart, is a directive towards a frame of mind and away from any actual tactics of interpretation. The language of rational observation as a means of evaluation starts to feel increasingly performative in these manuals, a way for appraising to claim the authority of a science to mask its inability to make perception itself act as such. And you see this language in many of these prefaces about appraisal becoming a science in this moment. But what's interesting to me is at the same time that the kind of center of the real estate profession is trying to professionalize and treat observation and appraisal as a kind of science, that there were people operating on the periphery of the field who are using that same language against real estate itself, and these tactics called blockbusting. And what happened in Chicago was a kind of a famous hub for blockbusting. So what that meant was these kind of hucksters on the edge of the real estate market who are both white and black and pretty in pretty equal numbers, which I think is quite interesting. They would notice that a neighborhood was going to turn, right? Or they would think they could turn a neighborhood. So what they would do, these are what the anecdotes about blockbusting say. The most famous one is that they would hire a black woman to kind of walk a stroller up and down a street and create some sort of racial panic and have people sell quite quickly. This developer would kind of swoop in, buy the land for the cheap, and then sell it to the incoming African Americans looking to kind of live in that neighborhood for a profit, for quite a large profit. So I'm interested in these practices of blockbusting. So there's this story of the woman in the stroller, which I've read in countless accounts of blockbusting, but I've never seen the actual source. So if anyone knows the source of that story, I'd love to find out about it. It sounds like a kind of wives' tale, so I'm not sure how true it is. But there are other more documented acts of blockbusting where they'd hire young black teenagers to walk down the streets to seem really virile and seem like a sexual threat. They would inundate neighborhoods with phone calls and flyers, these kind of harsh scare tactics. So it's interesting that the same language of empiricism that Babcock and these manuals are suggesting that their appraisers use are the same tactics that these blockbusting entities are taking for granted, right? That they're performing on, they're taking the kind of fallibility of observation and kind of twisting it and using it to their own purposes. Okay, one more example for one of these manuals. The language of empiricism gets even hazier and more slippery once we get to the mid-century. So then you get all this liberal apologetics wrapped up in the language of appraisal. So this is from Earl Teckemeyer's How to Value Real Estate, the Foremost Factor in Selling, which is from 1956. So this section that this is in is called Infiltration of Foreign or Racial Groups. So this is Teckemeier. Quote, the danger of deflated values from such sources is so self-evident that it does not require heated debate or lengthy discussion. Where a whole area is changing over, as many of them are in many cities in America today, there is a consequent change in values. It is not difficult to ascertain the areas where such changes are taking place, and not difficult at all to determine, by comparing recent sale prices of properties on the market, what the normal percentage of devaluation must be to bring the value in line. So you can already hear the defensiveness in this, right? It's not difficult. It's so self-evident. We don't even have to have this discussion in print about whether this is right or not. And once you get into the 60s, that language is really intense. It's really like, we can't change anything. This is the market. It gets more and more apologetic, but you can already see it. It trying to fight against itself in its own language. So what is striking about Teckemeyer's passage is that the language of surveying the neighborhood prominent in previous manuals has now been removed or sidestepped. The dangers of infiltration are so self-evident and not difficult to either determine or ascertain that both the intellectual pose of empiricism and the what of interpretation are both written out of here, right? So now he's saying, if you just go look at the charts, right? If you look at how the prices are different, right, you can already, we don't even have to have this facade of empiricism anymore. The passage is not geared towards a motive framework of assessment, but rather a defense of what has already become self-evident, pointing towards an assessment that has seemingly already taken place in the past and thusly needs no further elaboration. He manages to reify racial accounting of property valuation without ever having to utter a word related to race. The evaluator in his assessment needs only to be aware of the financial consequences of a neighborhood's changing over. If Babcock's appraiser was the ultimate Enlightenment hero, boldly empirical in his observational work, then Teckemeyer's appraiser is merely a number cruncher, conveniently beholden to the stats. So the FHA and the HOLC, which is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which is kind of the sister bureaucracy to the FHA, were not only writing manuals for appraisers in the field, they were also getting these agents to report back on their own findings about neighborhoods and using this hyperlocal data, producing their own maps and studies of roughly 140 metropolitan areas. This is a kind of a mind-boggling project in the scope of it, right? And I'll talk a little bit about how this worked. So Carl Nightingale writes about this process in his book, Segregation, A Global History of Divided Cities, and he says that both the FHA and the HOLC, quote, engaged in enormous projects to map all the urban neighborhoods of the United States with the goal of identifying the most promising areas for future residential investment. Excuse me. So these studies were primarily conducted in secrecy. If you go to the archives, they're stamped confidential for publication. It's really meant to be this internal data that only flowed between realtors and the federal government. And so the way, who was actually the people, who were the people on the ground? They were mostly realtors associated with the National Association for Real Estate Brokers, the same realtors who would become the audience for these findings. So again, just to like break down that process. So you have these realtors who are at the kind of core of the profession, part of the professional guild, who would walk around and gather this data. And they had forms, and I'll talk about those forms in a second. They would report this data back to the FHA. The FHA would create giant maps of neighborhoods, neighborhood by neighborhood basis. Give them certain grades, right? This neighborhood is grade A, right? It's all white, it's probably not gonna change over. That's where we will finance mortgages in that area, right? Grade, I can't remember the lowest grade, E or F, is all black, right? We're not gonna really finance mortgages in that area, right? Because it's unstable neighborhood, right? So even if you wanted to move to a mixed race neighborhood, right, it would be very hard to get the financing to do so. So the FHA is amassing this data, creating these maps, and then circulating the maps back to the realtors. So this kind of weird network of exchange. Nightingale describes the federal government as setting up, quote, a nationwide network of exchange where local data was ushered up to these federal agencies before then making its way back to the local realtor. Thus, the mapping studies, Nightingale writes, quote, became a kind of proprietary forum for the national dissemination of local information about property values. Okay, so Nightingale's talked about this. Any historian of the suburbs who's worth their degree has kind of talked about this process to a certain extent. Kenneth Jackson, David Rudiger, Jennifer Light. I could go on and on about people who've kind of looked at this. But they run into...
I was just going to say, Kenneth Jackson is our...
Plug. He literally wrote the book on this stuff, right? The first book on this stuff, Crabgrass Frontier, where he's really did the kind of landmark study of these practices and showed just how deeply racialized the process of suburbanization was. Not that people didn't think it was, but really kind of crunched the numbers, did the digging in these archives. And so many people have also kind of continued in their stead looking at the kind of forms that the FHA was giving to realtors to norm their racial reporting. After all, in order for a map of red line neighborhoods accounting for large swaths of the city to work, the evaluator's process for identifying inharmonious groups, and that was the term the FHA most commonly used, would need to be somewhat coherent across different blocks. It had to be coherent for it to make sense, but it also had to be flexible, because what was inharmonious in one neighborhood might not be inharmonious in another neighborhood, right? Armenians might be a big problem in one kind of hyper-local market, but, you know, unidentifiable or unlegible in another one, right? So it had to be both capacious but flexible enough. So the forms had to kind of look that way. So the most standard form was this report evaluator form issued by the FHA, where it asked the appraiser to mark, in addition to notes about the physical properties of the home, the presence of inharmonious racial and social groups, and whether there was a danger of their future infiltration. So it was both a kind of a now cast and a future cast, right? You had to kind of make a case. What's striking to me about this form, and many like it, is that, again, what it means to tally and how they were doing this tallying and surveying is really not well understood. We have a stack of these. I actually haven't gone to see them. I'm hoping to go see them this summer. They're in the National Archives too, at College Park, in this large city survey file. But my hunch is, and I think from the historians whose work I've read who've kind of seen these files, is that, you know, you have the data, but you don't have first I walked to this house, right? And then I counted how many people, right? And then I understood who was there, right? We don't have that kind of narrative of how they're actually doing the surveying work. We just know it gets done, and we see it in these maps, but the kind of, the front end work of that mode of perception and interpretation is not really well known. So this is where I think literature has something to tell us about this moment in certain ways. So where the FHA's forms and manuals stop short of telling its appraisers how to read and interpret inharmonious groups, assuming that one knows them when they see them, the longer arm of this project, perhaps, is going to involve positing literature as a site for learning how this reading was getting done. Laws and regulation, literature and writings about the built environment frame not just changing opinions about the facts of race, they tell us how local factors beyond the body itself also frame processes for racial reading in ways we have to fully account. And so I really want to kind of, the project that I'm thinking about is, you know, to account for how the suburbs and this kind of these changing neighborhoods, in light of my first project, which is really about density, right, and vertical scale, right, which is a certain kind of conditional, makes certain kind of specific conditional difficulties of seeing other bodies and reading them and knowing how to encounter them different, right? Once you get to the mid-century and you have this kind of horizontal movement out, right? This movement to lower density spaces, right? This movement based on commuting, right? Which changes the temporality and rhythms of everyday life and the perceptual conditions of everyday life. That those are different conditions, right? And so I'm interested in thinking about how architecture changes the way that this accounting was getting done. So if these manuals, the manuals that I talked about in the first half of this talk, lay out the what of these mandates, I want to insist that with this burgeoning project, that literature, when placed alongside these manuals, can help us think about the how of appraisal in a broader sense, denaturalizing the process of racial reading by narrating how we move from looking at and feeling race to treating this as concrete racial knowledge. I ultimately want to suggest, maybe I'm being very tentative here, that modes of racial reading were being altered by processes of suburbanization or urbanization in the 20th century, rather than just being applied to racial bodies within these spaces. In other words, the unquestioned act of racial interpretation these manuals seem to take for granted were themselves being changed by the buildings they were ultimately trying to sell. So this is kind of where this project emerges of, and this is my case for what literature can do. And I think it's interesting that literature is both useful for us kind of looking back and trying to understand something, so a kind of historical project, but also with a test case I'm going to present to you now with someone like John Cheever, who's writing these stories, hundreds of them being published in the New Yorker, right, week after week, and that, you know, the New Yorker's greatest circulation were not New Yorkers, right, but it was suburbanites who had been New Yorkers and still kind of enjoyed being called New Yorkers, that they were on the trains, right, reading reading the New Yorker, right, and that these processes of codifying racial reading were happening in real time, right, and that there was this kind of more immediate feedback process that we can think about in terms of literature and print culture as it's working at mid-century, in terms of the rhythms of temporality, the temporalities of commuting, which are changing the way that people are reading at this moment, right? And so literature has a kind of time-specific and a site-specific role to play, I think, in this story about how people come to think about race and how to talk about it or not talk about it, right? To talk about it in the rhetoric that starts to get used in this moment. David Freund has done a really great job of talking about this. His study, which is called Colored Property, he really looks at the shift from the early 20th century where the language around race and housing was, you know, you could just say openly, I don't want to live next to X person, right, because I don't like them, right? Or I think they're inferior, I just don't get along with them, right? In the mid-century, that language changes. It becomes, I don't want these people to live next to me because I don't want my property values to go down. And that's not to say the language of hate wasn't there. It certainly was, but the discourse and the grammar is changing. I was just talking to someone about this, and they were saying the language today is about the schools, right? Is that that the schools are bad, right? I don't want to live in that neighborhood because the schools are bad, which is tied to property taxes, which is ultimately tied to property once again. So I'm interested in that change, but I think there's more happening in the language about race. I don't want to just claim that the language around race changes, but the entire perceptual apparatus for thinking and engaging with it is changing with this kind of massive change in the built environment that's happening. Okay, so I'm going to now switch to talk a little bit about Cheever to set up some of the things that I think he can start to tell us. So more than any of the other suburban writers at mid-century with whom he is often lumped, so that would be who? Richard Yates, my student Danny is working on right now, and Revolutionary Road, Updike, John O'Hara, Sloan Wilson. I don't think, those are the biggies. I'm sure I'm forgetting some. You know, the kind of canon of suburban literature we recognize today. Cheever, John Cheever, who was known as the Chekhov of the suburbs, constructed his stories to foreground the suburbs not only as places but processes of racialization, marking the new mechanizations of whiteness minted by the recent affordability of federally backed mortgages. So I do think that Cheever is doing something exceptional in his work that other suburban writers aren't exactly doing. And I write about this at length in a different paper. When Cheever dies in the 80s, James Baldwin is interviewed. In 2 interviews in '84, he talks about, like, Cheever was really interesting, right? Of all the white writers in the world, right? I really like that John Cheever. It's just a fascinating thing to hear James Baldwin say. He has a lot of fondness for him and talks about the kind of things that his work does compared to Updike, right? Updike is his foil. And so I do think there's something specific about Cheever and the way that he's writing race that is not incidental, and that all kinds of Black writers in particular in the 20th century were kind of drawn to. Toni Morrison, also a big Cheever fan. Cheever and Ellison had this kind of weird frenemy relationship to one another. They were both at the American Academy in Rome at the same time, so they're quite close. They like had the same dog genealogy. Like, they had dogs that were related to one another. So there are all these kind of weird networks that Cheever's plugged into. And in a different paper, I make the argument that we should understand Cheever as more of a product of the Great Migration literature rather than this kind of mid-century suburban canon that he's usually kind of pigeonholed into. Cheever suburbanites openly, I think, invoke tropes of passing, double consciousness, and minstrelsy, and coming to terms with whiteness's more capacious, if still divisive, definition at mid-century. So I'll be focusing primarily on his short story collection, The Housebreaker of Shady Hill, which comes out in 1958. Most of those stories are originally published in The New Yorker. He writes a couple extra and kind of packages them. So the deal with this collection is all the stories take place in this one suburb called Shady Hill. It's not exactly a Levittown kind of suburb. It's a little bit more wealthy than that, but it's not a wealthy suburb either. It's somewhere on that spectrum. And the stories work where they're not, I wouldn't call them interrelated stories, but the same characters kind of weave in and out. You'll see the same characters kind of moving in the background. So it's a sense of a community somewhat, but really disparate in other ways. So I'm going to talk about Cheever, but at first I actually want to place him next to someone else. I think by doing this kind of quick comparison, we'll be able to see what Cheever's mapping in a kind of different way. So to see the revisions to white racial norms that Cheever's suburban stories remark upon, it's helpful to put it in conversation with an earlier master narrative of suburban belonging, The Great Gatsby. So The Great Gatsby is not exactly what you think of when you think about the suburbs and suburban literature. It's a little early for the mass suburban time. Gatsby's 1925, and the eggs aren't exactly Levittown either, right? They're these really elite castles, right? If you've seen the movie, they didn't exactly look like that in the movie. Those are a little over the top, but they were kind of, quite opulent and for the wealthy, right? There was no middle class. I mean, Nick Carraway lives in this little hut in between, right? But it's only because he's part of this wealthy network that he can live there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how whiteness works in that space, in that kind of suburb, to then kind of point to what Cheever's doing with the suburbs. So for Gatsby, from his mansion, a replica Anglo-Saxon castle that declares a little too literally his designs on claiming this heritage, to his avowal of the name Gats, G-A-T-Z, for the more wasp-sounding two-syllable moniker he adapts, Gatsby. As Walter Ben Michaels has famously written about him, quote, Gatsby is not just posing as someone with impressively reputable and visible income, he is passing as a white man with a legitimate claim to the intrinsically racialized leisure class. So Walter Ben Michaels makes this kind of foundational argument that Gatsby is a passing character, classic passing character. The novel's written in 1925. This is the height of the passing novel in the United States, right? There are tons of melodramas written about passing. There's a real national interest in passing. If you've seen Imitation of Life, you kind of know how that melodrama might go. And so if you put the novel within that context, Gatsby's claim as a white man is continually being hinted that he's not white, right? It's not just that he's an outsider, right? His outsider status is constantly being tied to his kind of the suspicions about his racial heritage. So no matter how much property Gatsby acquires, and no matter how good his performance of whiteness becomes, because the construction of whiteness in this moment remained one based in blood over gesture, Gatsby's project is doomed to fail. And a good flashpoint for this is the Rhinelander trial, which happened also in 1925, and it was a case that took place in upstate New York, centered on the marriage of Alice Jones, who is a mixed-race woman, and Kip Rhinelander, who was the son of, unsurprisingly, a wealthy real estate family. And so Kip knew that she was of mixed race. He knew her father. He hung out with their family. But Kip's family found out about the marriage and kind of pushed him into suing for an annulment on the grounds that he was deceived, that he didn't know about her race. So the trial is really it's one of the many trials of the century, but it's covered in all kinds of national newspapers. And basically what happens is Alice makes the case, or her lawyers make the case, that blood is on the skin, that Kip should have been able to read read her race from her visual presentation. Kip's lawyers make the opposite claim. They keep pointing to her father. They keep talking about her bloodline. So they're trying to make this case that it's in the blood, and no matter what Kip could see or couldn't see, right, it's important that we see her father, right? So we are constantly reminded of the bloodline that runs through her. So what ends up happening is Alice, under much duress, goes back into the private chambers of the court with just the jury and the judge, and she kind of pulls down her dress and shows her breasts to the court. Or to the jury. And that's what kind of seals the deal. She wins the case because they look at her breasts and they say, oh, your husband would have seen that, and those are black breasts. This is a real trial, I promise you. This really happened. And she ends up winning the case, and kind of ends up having kind of a tragic downfall. And it's unclear about how much she really wanted to do this, obviously, but she ends up doing it and winning. In this case, you can see it. Nella Larson references it in passing as kind of what might happen to her friend if she reveals, right? She's like, oh, the Rhinelander case, right? People knew about this, right? And it's remarkable. It's unbelievable to think that it happened, but it did. I bring this up because the treatment of Gatsby's body in The Great Gatsby loosely follows the reasoning behind this verdict. Once Tom implies the taint and bloodline in Gatsby's bloodline in the climactic New York hotel scene, framing him within the conceit of passing, that no level of performance or property could outmaneuver, his fate is sealed. At that point, that's when Daisy kind of gives up. She relents. She returns to the more secure network of whiteness that she can't really afford to leave. And Gatsby goes on to have the kind of classic melodramatic passing ending, right? He dies in the pool. No one's really there to witness it, right? It's like classic passing melodrama. But the kind of moral for me in the story is that space is not yet enough to secure Gatsby the full protection of whiteness. By the time we get to the mass suburb of Shady Hill, space can indeed make someone white under this term's newly expanded parameters. Not everyone, but it certainly could have made Gatsby if he had been in Shady Hill. Shady Hill is in fact comprised entirely of Gatsbys, whose current performances trump buried bloodlines or historical affiliations. The suburbs, dismantling previously ethnic enclaves within the city through processes of redlining, created a kind of new tautology of whiteness that rested less on pedigree and more on the flatter and less nuanced readings gauged by a mortgage map, right? So that kind of specter of the mortgage map. How does race change when it's defined by a map, right? Or kind of categorized through a map, and the map has such strong consequences for the reorganization of whiteness, right? So to think about how that kind of trickles down and changes what happens around the definition of whiteness. So if you could get a mortgage to buy a house in Shady Hill, adopt its social codes, and look white enough, you could be white with no further questions asked. In the Shady Hill of 1958, there was no Tom Buchanan rooting around in one's history fishing for a smoking gun, right? That's not the hermeneutics of racial suspicion in Shady Hill, right? Everyone is constantly turning a blind eye to this evidence, right? And in some sense, it's because the mortgage maps have done that work, right? Or have claimed to have done the work, or the alibi for having done that work, right? If you got the mortgage, you're good, you're in, right? You look white enough, you're not gonna devalue anyone's property. As long as you act right, you're gonna be okay, right? The community will rally around you. In fact, there are many times when characters actively turn blind eyes to such evidence. The community has invested in their fellow neighbors' whiteness and recognizes the need for a collective effort in maintaining it for their mutual financial value. So whiteness becomes increasingly spatialized as well as embodied as the suburbs provide an escape hatch from urban identity feared to be collapsing into ethnic identity. Okay. All right, so passing in particular emerges in Housebreaker as a kind of a necessary norm, the condition of this new broadening category of whiteness itself, rather than the melodramatic outlier in need of revelation as genre precedent once demanded. So again, going back to the imitation of lives of the world, or if you've read Passing, or Plum Bun, any of these melodramas of Passing, that passer always has to get outed in some way and always has to die. And Cheever is kind of drawing from these literature, drawing from these tropes, but with a very, very different consequence. As the normal state of affairs, Passing haunts the text as several characters gesture towards past and origins, suggesting other identities and affiliations now shed. So you have a character like Johnny Hake, who, quote, learned to chin on the framework of East Side apartment house canopies, We have the dark-haired, dark-eyed wife of businessman Charles Flint, who pushes a little too forcefully for a public library that would make the community vulnerable to outsiders. She gets cloaked in all these marks of otherness. The Donald Rison, who, quote, grew up in a small town in the Middle West, the son of a man who abandoned his wife and family when Rison was young. So there was this kind of genealogical doubt. And so I really do think that the tropes of passing are quite subtle, but Cheever was, I mean, he grew up in this moment of the passing novel, right? And this is where this argument about the great migration literature and the literature of white flight being much more intertwined than we give them credit really matters. And the thing with Shady Hill, right, is no one is from Shady Hill, because 15 years ago, Shady Hill didn't exist, right? It was farmland. So no one has any claims to genealogical knowledge of one another, right? And so the kind of framework of blood isn't going to work, right? There's like one ghostly person who remains from the old farmland times who's popping up and is an outsider, right? She's constantly reminding them, I was here when there were just cows, right? And they hate her for it. But Shady Hill has this kind of new space, this kind of space that no one has a claim to, in a certain way, can absorb all of these characters who are from elsewhere, whose genealogy is constantly being hinted and teased in these stories as potentially being questionable, illegible, or potentially illicit. That only a few decades prior, these hints were the hallmarks of the literature of racial passing. But if traditional passing narratives were built on the certainty that the past will follow one into the present, Cheever's story suggests that the financial incentive behind letting passers pass now trumps this earlier narrative imperative. Space becomes a much more convenient seat for whiteness in Shady Hill than hidden histories and bloodlines. We learn across the stories that the community is not really tied together by class or real wealth, since many of the characters are either secretly broke or publicly broke. And the neighborhood can absorb that, right? No one's kicked out because they're poor, right? Everyone tries to work around it, right? There are constantly economic crises, marital problems, or excessive abuses of alcohol, right? And these are kind of the hallmarks of a Cheever story. And none of those really shake the foundation of the story at all. They're actually the things that hold the neighborhood together, right? Under this kind of enclave of whiteness, the signifier of the shared experience that the social world ultimately rests on. It is to everyone's benefit to let passers be who conform to the performances of whiteness required of them. So I'm just going to give you really a very, very quick case of a story that acts a little bit differently in this volume. So the stories populating the collection's first half are generally pretty stylistically uniform. Some are written in third person while others are told in first. They all congeal around some kind of plot that revolves around the gap between a public performance and private doubt, right? That these characters are moving in the suburbs, acting as if everything's okay, but really there's some sort of secret crisis, right? Or not so secret crisis. It's usually an open secret. And these stories are kind of told, if you've never read a Cheever story, his hallmark of his style is to both be kind of satirical and judgmental, a bit critical of this lifestyle, but also to be really empathetic about it, right? So he's not constantly punishing his characters in the way that Richard Yates punishes his characters, right? Or other suburban novel narratives that you can think of that really punish its characters for being there, right? Cheever is a little bit more ambivalent about this space, and it really comes through in the stories. But Cheever interrupts this formula with the story that comes right in the middle of the collection, which is called The Worm in the Apple. It's a stylistic break from the narratives that sandwich it, as this story is much more mechanistic and openly satiric than the others making up the collection. So it's really short, it's under 2,000 words. I'll give you the opening line, you can kind of get the sense of what I'm talking about. As it meditates on the genre of suburban fiction by detachedly exaggerating its tropes. So here it is, quote, "The Crutchmans were so very, very happy and so temperate in all their habits and so pleased with everything that came their way that one was bound to suspect a worm in their rosy apple," which is kind of the template of any suburban story ever, right? That, oh, they seem happy, but they're not, right? That's Revolutionary Road, that's American Beauty, that's every suburban trope, right? So he's laying it out in the first sentence, right? This is what we expect from this story, and I'm gonna kind of perform it for you in this way. I'm going to show you how it works. And it really does it is this kind of hyper-satiric, mechanistic story. So the first of these worms occurs when the family son starts dating Carrie Witchell from Mapledale, a lower-class suburb disparagingly marked by its frame houses, recurrently appearing in the collection as Shady Hill's greatest threat. So you'll get these references to Mapledale, the kind of Levittown-ish suburb that's that's threatening to bring down and infiltrate and invade Shady Hill in all kinds of ways. That's why they don't want a public library. They don't want the people from Maple Dell coming over to use their library, because everyone should have their own private library in Shady Hill. But lest we imagine Maple Dell to merely mark class difference, Cheever writes that Carrie, quote, is really beautiful, and everyone knows how her shrewd old parents are planning to climb out of Maple Dell on the strength of her white skin. I'm really interested in this language because white is not a term that actually comes up in Cheever's work explicitly at all. It's only there in one other story. I think these stories are all about race without kind of talking about race in interesting ways. But this is the one place where in the story that's about the kind of core narrative of the suburbs, where whiteness appears not once but twice. In this endeavor, Carrie Witchell, would have joined many of the other residents of Shady Hill who too use their body and gestures to better their situations, as implied by many of the stories that surround this one. So many of the characters in Shady Hill are there because of the power of their white skin. She's not the only one. But what differentiates Carrie from these other passers is that she tries passing too close to home. Her spatial and racial origins cannot be overlooked because they mark boundaries still actively feared by Shady Hill as a threat to financial value built on its racial value. It is in Worm, a meta-commentary on the construction of the suburbs and its tropes, couched in rhetoric unavailable to Shady Hill itself, where Cheever can explicitly racialize these fears. And this will be my closing line. Everywhere else in the collection, Maple Dell's danger is strictly coded in the language of space and value alone. This open utterance about skin, about whiteness, buried at the collection's midpoint, one of only 2 references to be found in the entire collection, functions both spatially and structurally in ways more akin to a core internal to its structure rather than a worm. Okay, so I'm going to end there.
So we have some time for questions. I guess I'm leading all over the seats in this space. So we have some time for questions.
Okay, I have read Cheever.
Mm-hmm.
Don't think I have, maybe I have.
Yeah.
So my point very partly is covered up.
Sure.
But also just thinking about sociological works, media responses to real estate laws.
Sure.
In the city, to do with whatever, neighborhoods, white flight. And thinking about the relationship between ethnicity and race.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about that when we were talking about gas.
Yeah.
The passing there is, from some Minnesota ethnic
Sure.
to being lost.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a category, or 2 series of categories we usually ever discuss with Cheevers.
Yeah.
And that's my question.
Yeah.
How much is the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant matter here?
Yeah.
Because the way in which liberals writing about real estate laws are
Mm-hmm.
good, in the southwest side of Chicago,
Yeah.
just blockbusting the bonds
Sure.
of African-American households was white ethnic.
Yeah.
Brackets.
Yeah.
Catholic,
Yeah.
Is this a factor?
Yeah, it is a factor, and it's part of the change that I want to mark, right, is that, Gatz isn't white, right, in 1925, right? But what's interesting about Cheever, and, I'm interested in the category of whiteness that expands, right, that white flight, I think is a real misnomer of a term because it assumes that whiteness existed before the flight, and actually it's the flight that makes whiteness what it is, able to be kind of this capacious whiteness. What's interesting about Cheever is that the housekeepers that they keep are mostly Eastern European ethnic characters. And so they're the kind of, and the way that they're coded is fascinating because it's both in terms of class and in terms of race, right? And so there are no black characters. I think there's one black character in Cheever that's not explicitly marked as black, but if you know the passing novel, she's clearly black. And at the end, she takes the character's face and kind of puts it in the mud and makes him black, right? It's a very racial story, but no one's read it that way. But where race does explicitly pop up as something that can be talked about and expressed is around these kind of more ethnic whites who are the cooks and the gardeners who are commuting on the trains to kind of do the upkeep. And so it's kind of, Cheever can talk about that more explicitly in racial terms, whereas when there's no actual black people, the language of race, can get subsumed in these other ways. So yeah, it's both about, it is different, right? Because the time periods are different. So that's also partly why Gatsby would have an easier time in Shady Hill, right? Because it was that moment that made Gats able to be considered as a kind of part of the network of whiteness, whereas 20 years ago, depending on the neighborhood, not so much. Yeah. Don't be.
So when you're talking, you mentioned how you use fiction to kind of see the backwork or the frontwork of that producing these documents.
Yeah.
As you think about going to the archives
Yeah.
and having these documents that have this air of normalness,
Mm-hmm.
what are these tools of literary theory that you're going to use to kind of break down some of those categories and think
Yeah.
about the ways in which they're constructing these imagined people in neighborhoods?
Good question. I don't know if I have any tools. Close reading. I don't know. I mean, I'm hoping that the fiction itself will kind of be the tools, right? Just because we're not getting it from the forums for the most part. I'm gonna go do my homework and make sure that's true. I'm gonna go look at those forums. But I'm interested in, again, as narrative is both this kind of way of filling in what we don't know, but also this way of kind of codifying those processes in real time, right? That this fiction was circulating in very site-specific ways and in ways specific to the changes in the built environment. And that, Cheever was really popular in this moment. He's on the cover of Time magazine. He's kind of, when you say the New Yorker, Cheever is the name that follows from that, right? I mean, he had this cachet, and so I'm interested in what was happening when people were reading these stories, right? And people who were living in the suburbs, right? Is it this kind of self-punishing moment of, I live there and I recognize the humor, but I'm not one of them, right? And I think some of the minutiae I've talked to some people who work on this period, and the New Yorker in particular kind of cued me into going to look at the New Yorker itself as it's trying to maneuver both kind of poking fun at the suburbs, but also relying on suburban clientele for its circulation, right? It's always constantly being criticized for being too middlebrow, and that's part of it. And Cheever's walking this kind of fine line between being empathetic and catching these moments in the light, right? The suburbs are really quite beautiful. Also kind of talking about the happy Crutchmans whose heads are going to come off at the end of the story or something. So I don't know if I have any tools, but I'm hoping that the literature itself will kind of show me some of those tools, right? Does that make sense what I'm saying? To just think about how he's kind of and that's why narrative is so useful for me more than anything else, because it really is about this process of perception, right? How do you go from moving your body in the world, seeing something, to thinking you know something, right? And how does it happen around race, right? As something that's both historically contingent, but also really spatially contingent, right? Depending on the built environment you're in, right? What you see and how you see it changes. So that's why narrative in particular is really important for me, for kind of trying to think about the interpretation of race as a process, right, that takes place over time, that people are trying to narrate and put into words and describe in certain ways. Hey, Lauren.
Can you speak a little bit more about, I guess, what you saw or what you see, sort of like the tonal injection in the story arc? As in, like, it sounds like these narratives sort of depart from kind of like the original casting narrative that seems to inspire some sort of like hysteria.
Mm-hmm.
We won't know who's who.
Yeah.
It's going to be really bad, but like these narratives seem to be a little bit more, from your description, I guess, complacent or just observational.
Yeah, and they get to be like that because of the suburbs, right? Because when you're in a space that's already been vetted in a certain extent, right? So theoretically, the FHA has done that work for them, right? So once they get to Shady Hill, it's all good, right? But what's interesting in the stories is, a lot of them are commuting stories. So half of them take place in the city and half of them take place in the suburbs. And the processes through which people make observations in those two different spaces are radically different. So when the characters are in the city, usually it's the white male characters who are moving through the city, the language of density and speed and how that, the feeling of disaffiliation, right? That really colors the way that they're interpreting and having encounters with people in the city, right, versus the encounters they have in the suburbs, right? In some ways, the suburbs allows them to be complacent, right? And this is kind of the trick of the suburbs, right? So in the skyscraper project, I talk a lot about white metropolitans really feeling like they were disappearing, right? Both kind of numerically and demographically, but spatially, right? Visually, right? No one can see me anymore. My whiteness has no purchase here, right? Because we're all together and we can't see each other. And they talk about feeling like chattel slaves, all this kind of weird stuff around racial affect and seeing and feeling, right? And in a sense, the suburbs solves that problem, right? It's this kind of release valve, right? Where they can be in the space without all this kind of hermeneutic paranoia, right? Around race, because again, this kind of the mortgage financing has kind of done it for them, and there's a train between them and the city, right? And the stories are all this. There's all these interesting moments around the train, right? Who's coming in and who's coming out, and that also is a different site of perception and interpretation that happens in these stories. So in some sense, it's about the space, right, that allows them to think and see race differently. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting because, yeah, you're right. In Native Son, it's so fascinating because it's happening like hourly, right? There's a new edition of the paper and there's a different map of where people are going, right? And so that is a great question. Like you see that kind of instant circulation happening already, right? But you also see the paranoia of needing to map constantly, right? And it's very public, right? Everyone needs the map, right? Because they need to know where he is and are tracking him, right? And there's a way that in the suburbs, like the FHA needed the map, right? But no one else could have the map, right? It's completely secretive, right? No one was supposed to have those maps, right? And many of them have been destroyed. We don't have that many. A lot of that data, I think, from what I've read, is no longer there because, who wants to keep track of this stuff, right? It's not to their benefit, really, to make this stuff public. We do have some of it. So in a sense, the map, I think that's a really interesting corollary because the map is public at that point, right? People need the map to navigate. With the suburbs, the map can be invisible, right? It's already been mapped in a way that people don't have to see and confront, right? So they don't even have to use language of race because the map is elsewhere and it's kind of done the work or something. But that's a really great example around that question of the map. I want to think about that more. Thank you. Just come talk to me at another point. What do I want to add? No, come here to Ken Jackson and come to the whole forum, right? Ken Jackson is really, like I said, he's the guy who's did the footwork on this for the first time, about the historical side of what I'm talking about. So come hear it from him next week. But yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much.